والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. الأخوة الحضور، السلام عليكم. يسعدني أن أرحب بكم جميعا في إحياء غرفة الرياض، وأشكر الجميع مشاركتهم هذه المحاضرة التي تطرح موضوعا حيويا يهم المجتمع كله، والمتمثل في قضية مكافحة الفساد والاحتيال المالي الذي تحاربه الحكومة الرشيدة بكل الوسائل من خلال ما سنته من أنظمة وقوانين تكافح هذه الآفة الدخيلة على مجتمعنا السعودي المسلم الذي تحكمه مجموعة من القيم الدينية والاجتماعية التي ترفض هذه الممارسات المستهجنة وتنزل أشد العقوبة بالمرتكبين. وانطلاقا من المسؤولية الملقاة على عاتق غرفة الرياض ومركز الرياض للمنشآت الصغيرة والمتوسطة، فإنها تنظم هذه المحاضرة بهدف نشر وتعزيز الوعي المجتمعي وخصوصا لدى المنشآت قطاع الأعمال من أجل تطوير أنظمة الرقابة المطبقة لديه حتى لا تترك فرصة أمام ضعاف النفوس للوقوع في شرك الفساد والاحتيال المالي التي تلحق الضرر باقتصادنا وتجعل حفنة من الفاسدين والمحتالين يكونون ثروة حراما على حساب المجتمع والإفساد كقيمه ومعاييره الأخلاقية. الأخوة الحضور، لا شك أن محاربة هذه الآفة يعد عملا منسجما وداعما للأهداف التي تتوخاها رؤية المملكة المستقبلية 2030 وبرنامج التحول الوطني 2020 حيث تتجه لإعادة بناء اقتصادنا الوطني على أسس راسخة من الشفافية وكشف كل الممارسات الفاسدة وأعمال الاحتيال. ويسعدنا أن نستضيف في هذه المحاضرة اثنين من الخبرات العالمية، المدير التنفيذي روي كريسبي، المدير التنفيذي المساعد سام فاس فرنسي، حيث سيتحدث الأول عن محور ايزو 37001 النظام الإداري لمكافحة الرشاوي، وتناول الثاني محور تقييم مخاطر الاحتيال. والختام أشكر الحاضرين، وكما نأمل أن نحقق هذه المحاضرة نتائج مرجوة. Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to be with you this morning and to have the chance to introduce our guest speakers. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our speakers. Who's the first speaker? Roy. Please join me in warmly welcoming to Mr. Roy. في ترجمة في عند الزميلة حترجم لكم الآن، واللي عنده برضه مداخلة برضه حترجم المداخلة. والأسئلة how many speakers? Three speakers. Each one will have 20 minutes.
30 minutes max.
Okay. الأسئلة إن شاء الله حتكون بعد انتهاء السبيكرز، يعني الفترة كده ساعة ونص ولا ساعة؟ 1 hour. It's enough for you. It's 1 hour.
1.5 hours.
1.5 hours. أوكي. بعد ما يخلص تقريبا يعني 90 دقيقة نبدأ في الأسئلة إن شاء الله للمتحدثين.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the invite. We are honored to be here this morning to speak on the topic of fraud and corruption. We have three themes for you today. The first one will be a discussion on the ISO 37001 standard, the new anti-bribery management system. The second topic will be on fraud risk assessment by my colleague here, Srini. And the third topic will be data analytics to detect fraud by Dean Gilbert, sitting on my right-hand side. Just to give you a little background on myself, I'm one of the directors at Deloitte. I've been there for just under 1 year. I specialize in forensic investigations. I've conducted multiple investigations globally from everywhere from China to Chile and from Germany to South Africa. So my agenda today is really a chat about ISO 37001, as I've discussed with you. There's a brief introduction, followed by a discussion on the new standard, and then I'll take any questions that you might have. So we all know that bribery is a Saudi problem, right? Bribery only happens in Saudi Arabia. We'll let you think about that statement. Before we get into it, let me ask you this question. How do you think Saudi Arabia rates on the 2016 Transparency International Corruption Index out of 176 countries? Where do you think Saudi Arabia rates on that index? Close to the top? Close to the top. You mean we've got quite a good rating, or first 1 to 70? Within the first 70? Okay, let's see if you're right. So we came in 62 out of 176 countries that were ranked last year on the Corruption Perception Index, which is a little bit down from the previous year. The previous year we had a score of 52 in 2015, and last year we had a score of 46. So we've dropped slightly in terms of our ranking on the Corruption Perception Index. And some of the reasons for that is the failure to fight corruption in the Arab countries. It's not only ourselves that have dropped, a number of the Middle East countries have dropped in ranking in 2016. And the Transparency International cites, in order for Arab countries to improve, they must ensure effective, transparent systems that allow for accountable are in place. So we need systems in place, we need procedures, we need to have compliance and governance in place to prevent bribery. Just out of interest's sake, no Googling, who are the top ranked countries? Anybody want to guess who the top ranked countries? Which countries have the least corruption, in other words? Who are the least?
I think it's Canada.
Canada?
Yeah.
Okay. New Zealand? Okay. European? Okay, you say more the countries in the European base. Who said New Zealand?
No.
Yeah.
I said Canada.
Canada. Did somebody mention New Zealand? Okay. You're correct, sir. Denmark, New Zealand and Finland are the countries with the least corruption according to Transparency International. Anybody want to guess as to who's got who are the most corrupt countries?
I would say Italy.
Italy. China. Okay. Anyone else? Africa. Okay. That's a good guess. According to the index in 2016, the most corrupt countries are North Korea, South Sudan, and Somalia. So that would cover the African continent, as you spoke about earlier. So 2 of those countries are featured down there. So we're almost in the middle of the rankings there. In terms of our peers in the Middle East, where do you think we rank in terms of the other Middle East countries? The Middle East countries, where do you think we fit in? Are we near the top or are we near the bottom? No, Middle East countries, I think there's 15 of them. Where do you think we rank? Are we near the top of that?
Near the top.
Near the top. Okay, you would be right. We come in 4th in the rankings of the Middle East countries. So at the top of that ranking we have the UAE, Qatar, Jordan, and then Saudi Arabia comes in 4th. At the bottom of that list would be Syria. Interesting, it's an interesting article, an interesting read. If you want to follow up on the results of last year, they're available on the Transparency International website. And my statement earlier that corruption is only a Saudi Arabia problem is obviously not accurate. Corruption, as we see from the Transparency International map, is most certainly a global problem. Okay, with that in mind and that background, my talk is really about the new ISO 37001 standard. The standard was released in October last year, and it's really an all-encompassing system that helps organizations build a compliance program. Do any organizations here already implement ISO standards? I know SABIC would have ISO standards. Does anybody else work with ISO? Okay. I'll take you through the standard. So it was developed by ISO, which is the Organization for Standardization. They develop and publish international standards on a global basis. They provide standards to 163 countries, and over the years they've published thousands of global standards. The anti-bribery management system was introduced, like I said, in October last year. It's an all-encompassing compliance program or anti-bribery management system, and it's there to establish, implement, maintain, and improve an anti-bribery compliance program. It includes a series of measures which an organization must implement, which represent globally recognized anti-bribery good practices. Now we know that the Americans have got the FCPA, the British have got the UK Bribery Act, and what the ISO standards have done, they've really taken the best pieces of anti-bribery guidance from across the globe and incorporated it into one standard. The standard was initially started in 2013. There were 27 participating countries, 14 observing countries, and 7 liaison organizations. And interesting to note there that Saudi Arabia was one of the participating countries in the development of the standard. Who is the standard applicable to? Who can use the standard? The standard is flexible and can be a standalone, or it can be integrated into an overall management system and adapted to a wide range of organizations, including large, small, public and private sector organizations, non-governmental organizations, and it's applicable to any organization in any country. So it's really a fit-all standard. The standards obviously can be integrated with existing ISO standards like the ISO 9001 or 14001. The two main themes that the ISO standard addresses is outgoing bribery and incoming bribery. And when I say outgoing bribery, I mean bribery by the organization or by its personnel or business associates acting on the organization's behalf for its own benefit. So what I mean by that is the organization would be committing the bribery. And an example of that would be I need to acquire a mining license for my organization. I bribe an official at the Ministry of Mines. I pay him a bribe in order to get my license. That would be outgoing bribery. The organization pays the bribe to the government official in order to acquire their license. The other main theme that the standard covers is incoming bribery, where someone in our organization is bribed. And an example of that would be, for example, someone in your procurement department receives a bribe to disclose certain bidders' information to a third party. So my procurement manager, he receives 1,000 Saudi Riyal to release the bidding information of one of the other third parties to another bidder. That would be incoming bribery. We are bribed. Does the standard give a definition of bribery? The standard does not give a definition of bribery. The standard basically gives an indication of a guidance on what the meaning of bribery is. It doesn't define bribery. Bribery in Saudi Arabia is defined by the Czar. They've got their own definition of bribery defined for Saudi Arabia, but they do give guidance on what bribery is. And I'll just read that for you so you get an understanding of what the prohibited behaviors are. bribery would be the offering, promising, giving, accepting, or soliciting of an undue advantage of any value, directly or indirectly, and irrespective of location, in violation of applicable law, as an inducement or reward for a person acting or refraining from acting in relation to the performance of that person's duties. So that's the guidance provided by the standard. In terms of local law, the Nazar indicates they've got a very broad interpretation of bribery, and their interpretation or definition is every act that threatens the public interest as well as any abuse of the civil service in order to earn an individual advantage. So that's your local definition of bribery. So the standard is extensive. What I've done is I've summarized the standard into 13 sections, which I'll run through quickly, which will give you an indication of if you are implementing the standard, what needs to be done from an organizational perspective. 13 main requirements, and we'll run through them now. The first one is top-level commitment, and this is really a critical component to any anti-bribery compliance program. Without top-level commitment, it would be basically impossible to implement your anti-bribery compliance program. You need senior-level management buy-in to your program, as this will drive the process and entrench the program within the organization. A good example of top-level commitment was the banner we saw at Nazar at the national or international anti-corruption conference, which we attended yesterday. And there's a quote there from the Prince, the King, setting out the requirements of top-level commitment in terms of Saudi. That's one of the best top-level commitments that I've seen from a statesman. So, like I said, top-level commitment is an integral part of the compliance program. Without it, you're not going to be able to implement your compliance program. The second most important perspective is your anti-bribery policy. The policy needs to set out quite clearly what the prohibited actions are, so that staff members understand what is prohibited by your anti-bribery policy. And this policy obviously needs to be available to all staff members. It needs to be available on your intranet. It needs to be made available to staff members when they join your organization, and it needs to be provided to staff members in training throughout the course of their employment with the organization. The next theme is communication. Your anti-bribery compliance program needs to be communicated to everyone within the organization, so that all stakeholders understand the importance of the anti-bribery compliance program, what the prohibited actions are, and what the limitations are. Additionally, the program needs to be communicated to your external third parties. So what a lot of organizations are doing is they're training vendors, they're training their third parties on what their anti-bribery policies entail, so that there's no misunderstanding in terms of bribery or corruption. The next theme that is critical to implementing the compliance program is really adequate resources and budget. And that will mean that the organization will have to appoint a compliance manager, either in a permanent role or in a non-permanent role. But you need to have a compliance officer. You need to have adequate resources. That compliance officer needs to be able to report to the board, and additionally, he needs to have, like I said, additional as many resources as is required, additional compliance officers, and he needs to have the additional funding to be able to implement the compliance program. Awareness and training is another critical theme. and there needs to be adequate and appropriate anti-bribery training to all personnel on a regular basis. And there are different ways of doing this. A number of organizations have one-on-one training with their personnel on an annual basis. They also have online training for their personnel. Additionally, staff within sensitive positions like financial positions or CFO positions or procurement positions will receive additional anti-bribery training. Staff in lower positions that don't really interact with finance or other third parties or have a lower risk of committing bribes would receive a standard sort of training. Risk assessment, the most important building block besides top-level commitment to the anti-bribery compliance program is your risk assessment. The risk assessment is really the foundation of your compliance program. The risk assessment would be done right up front, and that would be done to establish what are the risks that are in the organization, that are facing the organization, and how are we going to go about mitigating these risks. The standard also talks about reasonable and proportionate, and in that they want the organization to demonstrate a genuine commitment to prevent and detect, respond to bribery in relation to its business activities, and implement measures that are designed to detect and respond to bribery. They need to make sure that whatever measures and controls they implement, these controls must not be so burdensome that they slow down the organization. So what the standard says is, don't have too many controls that make it difficult for your staff members to work and do their job. The organization must still be able to operate in a normal business fashion. Additionally, you shouldn't have too few controls, so that the controls don't pick up the bribes. You've got to just get the balance right. So that's why they talk about reasonable and proportionate. Additional requirements and areas that you should focus on that are susceptible to bribery would include gifts, political and charitable donations, client representative or public official travel, promotional expenses, sponsorship, community benefits, training, club memberships, personal favors, and confidential and privileged information. These are all areas that you need to take a specific look at that are susceptible to fraud. So you need to have additional controls over these specific areas. Employee process. Once staff have been trained on the anti-bribery compliance program, you need to ensure that they certify that they understand the training that they've just gone through, and that they certify additionally that they will not commit bribery in their organization. Additionally, coupled to this, there needs to be a process whereby staff members can be disciplined and apply the appropriate sanction once they breach the anti-bribery management system. And this needs to be clearly marked for staff. So there needs to be a disciplinary policy in the organization coupled to the anti-bribery management system or your code of conduct. Controls. The organization will need to implement appropriate financial and non-financial controls to manage the bribery risk. Also a critical area. A reporting channel. The standard talks about having a reporting channel, and when we talk about reporting channels, we mean there needs to be an avenue through which staff members can report bribery or other irregularities. So there needs to be a whistleblower hotline or some sort of tip-offs line that staff feel comfortable with using in order to report bribery through to senior management or to the board, depending on how that's structured. Investigate. The organization needs to have appropriate controls in place to investigate bribery. Once bribery is discovered, the organization needs to have a procedure that will investigate the bribery and determine what actually happened, who's responsible for that bribery, and ultimately refer the matter to the HR department for sanction, or additionally refer it outward to the authorities for investigation. Lastly, due diligence. Due diligence on your personnel. The ISO standard stresses that you need to conduct background checks on staff entering your organization. So you need to understand that you need to make sure that their qualifications are genuine, that their references check out, that they are who they say they are, that these staff members don't have any criminal records in terms of bribery, and conduct a proper due diligence on staff entering the organization. Additionally, staff within the organization moving to sensitive areas that have been in your organization for a long time. Let's say there's a staff member who's been there for 20 years and he's now being promoted to the CFO position. Additionally, there should be a background check or some sort of due diligence on these staff members moving into sensitive areas. Due diligence also applies to certain transactions, projects, activities, and business associates. The most high-risk area for any organization are your business associates. Business associates will most probably pay bribes on your behalf if they are acting on your behalf. They don't have the same standards as you have, they don't have the same values, they don't have the same policies and procedures. So what you find is a big organization has employed a team of consultants to work for them. These consultants don't have a code of ethics, and these consultants are involved in acquiring business licenses for the organization. You'll most probably find that the values that these consultants have are a lot lower than the big organization. So additionally, besides due diligence on your employees, you'll have to conduct due diligence on business associates. We need to understand who these people are. We need to do reference checks on them. We need to do due diligence on certain high-risk transactions. How will the standard benefit the organization? The standard provides minimum requirements and supporting guidance for implementing or benchmarking an anti-bribery management system. It provides assurance to management, your investors, business associates, that your organization is taking reasonable steps to prevent bribery. And if there's an issue that should ever go to court, you'll be able to demonstrate that the organization has taken reasonable steps to prevent bribery. Is the standard certifiable? The standard is certifiable by a number of bodies that are currently doing certification, just like they do certification for 9001 or 14001. So in a nutshell, these are the 14 or 13 points that would encompass your anti-bribery management system. If you put up on the board there, I'm not going to run through them. And then lastly, if you're interested in obtaining a copy of the ISO standard for yourself, the ISO standard is available on the ISO website, and I think the price is around $158 for the standard. Thank you very much. I'll take any questions. Okay. We'll take questions after everyone is finished. I'm going to introduce the next speaker, is Srini, and he specializes in fraud risk management.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Srini. I'm an assistant director with Deloitte. I've been with Deloitte for the last couple of years in Dubai. But historically, I've been with Deloitte for the last 8 years with India practice as well as US practice, primarily focusing on corporate investigations, anti-fraud programs and controls, and fraud risk assessments. Today, it's a great opportunity to present in front of Riyadh Chamber of Commerce, or Riyadh Chamber, explaining about fraud risk assessment, how it would be done, and the methodology that Deloitte applies in conducting the fraud risk assessments. Today, before going into the details of fraud risk assessment, I would like to take you through the basics of fraud. I mean, probably you would have heard what is a fraud in either in the newspapers or in terms of in your organization. So I believe everyone is pretty much aware of what is fraud, isn't it? I mean, do you know what is exactly defined as fraud? Any guesses? I mean, Roy talked about bribery and corruption, which is one important aspect of fraud and corruption. But a simple guess of what is basically a fraud defined as?
It's kind of an intentional misrepresentation.
Yeah.
It should lead to someone to take action on that. So it will have
Yeah, absolutely. You're bang on, spot on. Basically, there is no definition which has been defined unless you go to a dictionary and say what is fraud. But to define simply, it is a dishonestly obtaining a benefit, either with a deceit or by other means. There should be an intention where it says you need to defraud some person or a company. That is the basic underlying definition of fraud, if you categorize it as without going to the dictionary definition. How it would be conducted? It would be either conducted by an individual or internally within the company, or it could be conducted in collaboration with externally by other persons. And the other way of conducting is you will see frauds being conducted by the companies or against the companies. So there are various types of frauds I'll quickly take you through. But when someone discovers fraud or corruption that is punishable by fine, imprisonment, or both in some of the circumstances. Just want to highlight you some of the statistics across the Middle East. The first and the foremost one is most of us think fraud is prevalent only in few areas, but if you look at the statistics from the ACFE report, which is a global body that identifies and reports the number of incidents or the kinds of fraud, it has identified that the majority of the departments that are more susceptible to the fraud are sales department, operations, and the customer service departments. Those are actually very easily identifiable because those are the revenue earners for any company. So people will try to increase the sales volume or increase the sale price, sometimes reduce the sales price in order to get a benefit of bribery or in some kind of incentive from the customers. And also customer-facing jobs, they are very easy to perpetrate fraud, especially when you want to onboard a particular client, especially in a financial institution, if they don't follow the KYC, know your customer regulations. And moving on to the other important aspect, when you look at a fraudster, he'll be looking like similar to us. There is no difference. Basically, they are at a managerial level in this region. At least 47% of the fraudsters, according to the global profile of fraudsters, has been defined that those people are at the managerial level, where it is quite easy for them to circumvent the controls or override of the management controls. As we are talking, I mean, the main topic that I'm going to talk about is how to do the fraud risk assessments. So I picked this particular stat, which is how many organizations are actually done the fraud risk assessments, or how many are really aware whether fraud risk assessment have been done in their organizations in the last couple of years. Only it is to surprise that only 50% of the people or the companies have done the fraud risk assessment.
In Saudi Arabia or
It's in this Middle East region. It includes Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, all these Middle Eastern regions. So, as I would like to take this opportunity, would you have any information or knowledge about how fraud risk assessment has been conducted, or were you participant of fraud risk assessment in your organization in the last couple of years? Basically, risk assessment is more from the controls perspective, but fraud risk assessment is more from the identification of frauds where there could be a potential opportunity for fraud in your organization. That is what the primary focus of fraud risk assessments. Moving on to one of the important factors when we are discussing about fraud, how do you actually identify fraud, or what kind of factors you have in any incidents? Have you ever seen this fraud triangle, anyone of you, historically?
Yeah. In audit, actually, we do use these kinds of fraud triangle.
Yeah, so for any fraud risk assessment, we need to first of all understand what are the factors that actually contribute to make any fraud. The first, this particular triangle was invented by American criminologist called Donald Cressy. You can use these principles of the triangle for any fraud. If you come across any kind of fraud, you can actually identify how there is a pressure, opportunity, and rationalization for any instance. So usually employees do not suddenly wake up one morning and say, okay, I want to do fraud in my office today. Basically, they will have underlying factors. The first and foremost is the pressure. Either they have some sort of individual pressure to commit fraud. That could be a lifestyle pressure from the peers, or they have higher medical bills, or their families in need of money. So that would be the primary factor to conduct a fraud. And the second important factor is opportunity. This defines how a fraudster will conduct a fraud. It is basically a method how he's going to follow. That's especially when the company doesn't have appropriate internal controls. That gives a leverage or an opportunity for that particular person to conduct a fraud. And then once he conducts, he always feels that, okay, there should be a rationalization factor, or the mindset of that particular individual, like saying, okay, say for example, if that employee has been working in that company for last 20 years, he will say, okay, I've been working in that company, I have not been given pay raises appropriately all these years, so there's nothing wrong in doing a fraud in my company. And then probably he'll also think that I can repay whenever I have the money later on. That is how the process would start, but he will never be able to recoup what he has taken back from the company, or the situations may arise that he will not be able to return that back to the company. If you see, these are the three areas that are prevalent in any of the fraud cases. But if underlying fact is there is management override of controls happening in any of these incidents or fraud scenarios. And then also quickly talk about the types of frauds. In this region, you will see majority of them are asset misappropriations, like say embezzlement of cash or asset, or theft. And then corruptions, and corruption is another area which Roy has touched upon, especially the bribes, conflict of interest, non-disclosure of conflict of interest, leading to giving a kickback schemes or additional opportunities in that particular company. And then there is also financial reporting. Especially this happens when these companies have financial targets to meet the analyst expectations in stock exchanges, and there is obviously want to meet in terms of whether the numbers have been meeting to whatever the budgets they have actually agreed upon in the beginning of the year. Now moving into the fraud risk assessment, the details. Basically, wants to ask, why do we need to conduct a fraud risk assessment in any organization? Any guesses? I mean, the answer is there. Okay. I mean, historically, if you look at the frauds, how they have been conducted and what's happening now, the world has actually enhanced using the technologies. The fraudsters have continued to try to find out new ways of circumventing the controls, which gives opportunity to fraud. And also there are economic pressures, especially I can relate, the oil prices have gone down. There is significant pressure how we are going to meet the revenue targets for various companies, especially when the economy is slowing down. That creates, if you look at the fraud risk factor that we've discovered, there is a pressure which describes you might need to go and do some kind of extraordinary activity to meet those targets. Basically, fraud risk assessment aim of fraud risk assessment is to identify specific control issues or where there is an opportunity in the business, which is specifically to that particular industry, like say oil and gas or financial services or real estate companies. This gives a management and assurance which is more on a proactive basis, how fraud can be stopped or avoided, identifying what are all the possibilities in your company. That is the basic way what fraud risk assessment will give you. And also it identifies and creates an awareness within the management or the top leadership. It gives a tone at the top saying that the company wants to restrict any frauds that are going to happen, which is more on a proactive basis. And then it also gives you the tools how you can avoid identifying these frauds by identifying the controls, additional controls if there is any to be reintroduced. And also it identifies the kind of remedial actions which need to be prevalent as part of the fraud risk assessment. So the benefits would also go across the organization. As part of fraud risk assessment, this could be giving more insights to the internal audit function and also the compliance officers and as well as the overall legal teams. So basically in any fraud risk assessments, you will have three phases, I would say, which is identification of fraud scenarios, validation of fraud scenarios or schemes, and then monitoring. Basically, as we've discussed, fraud risk assessment is a scheme and scenario-based assessment that considers in a hypothetical situation how a fraud can happen in an organization. It doesn't mean that when we are doing the fraud risk assessments, fraud has actually happened in your organization, but hypothetically, what could potentially go wrong in any organization. As part of identification of fraud schemes, there would be, first of all, we need to identify what is a fraud risk in your organization. Fraud risk could be described as one, at a high level, what are the areas that are basically prone to fraud, occurrence of fraud. One example I can take is bid rigging, especially as you might know in the procurement department, there is always an opportunity that the suppliers might collude and try to do a bid rigging. That could be the broader fraud risk. But each fraud risk will have multiple scenarios. It is not restricted that it is only one fraud risk and you will have only one fraud scenario. Like say on bid rigging, there are multiple ways of bid rigging. So we will identify each possible scenario or a scheme to arrive at how many types of instances that could be perpetrated in an organization. And also we will consider the potential controls in place. And in my next slide, I will take you through the details how we actually do the risk assessment. The first and foremost, as we've discussed, the first one is the fraud risk factors, which will be determined based on the fraud triangle that we've discussed. Those are the factors whether you have opportunity or you have incentive or what kind of risk factors you have in place. In that phase, what the outcome of that process would be a schedule of fraud risk factors, and also the you will get an understanding how the environment of that company is, whether you had fraud risk policies and procedures or you had any framework, especially when a whistleblower or someone comes to the internal audit department or the legal, do they have any process how to do an investigation, or how a particular scenario can be managed by internal audit or by the legal counsel of that company. And the second process, second step, I would say it is, we will identify possible fraud scenarios and schemes by identifying the risk factors in phase one. And then that gives us at a high level what are the fraud risk scenarios you have, with the person who is probably responsible for that function, like say in the procurement, that the manager who is responsible for that would be aware or should be known what kind of controls they have and how such kind of scenarios can be mitigated. In that second phase, we will identify the schemes and scenarios. And in the third phase, we will prioritize based on I'll walk you through the methodology, how we will identify high, medium, and low categorization for each of the fraud risk. So it would be identified what could be the most important one, important fraud, especially when you're trying to come up with a remedial action plan. The fourth step is once you have identified the existing fraud risk, you will identify how the controls or what kind of existing controls you have in place which can remediate the fraud risk factor, and then we'll arrive at the residual risk, which is basically like say the case of bid rigging. You have identified how the possible bid rigging scenarios are, and then you have also identified the controls in place. Whether these controls will be mitigating those fraud scenarios, you will highlight, and then you will come to the conclusion, though we have the existing controls in place, but they are not sufficient to remediate whatever the scenario or scheme that we have identified. So we need to enhance our controls or control framework to mitigate that kind of fraud risk. But you might be wondering, is this, when we do the fraud risk assessment, is this completely going to be a foolproof in any organization? No, it is not, because as we've discussed, the environment is always evolving. It is not that you have an existing control that will be sufficient for the next 100 years in your organization, especially there will be change in the process or introduction of IT controls in place and new processes in the company. So across these, when we are doing this methodology, there should be a constant communication from the process owners, from the management to give the right tone at the top. So across all these steps, there should be a continuous communication, how the leadership wants to really take this forward, whether the tone at the top wants to present these findings to the management or the second tier leadership to highlight what kind of remedial actions they are taking, how they are trying to mitigate the fraud risks. as I mentioned, we will be, as part of our second step, once we've identified the fraud risks, we will be, I've given 5 fraud scenarios here, and then we will be identifying whether there is a probability and consequence of each scenario. Like say, I'll take the third or fourth example, where there is less effective IT infrastructure. What would be the probability, and what would be the consequence of less IT infrastructure in your organization? So when we discuss that with the IT manager or the person who is responsible, we will come to an agreement with that particular person, saying that okay, there could be breach of confidentiality is the basic fraud risk. So the likelihood of occurrence or the probability, how frequently it could happen. It could be high or medium or a lower probability, and what could be the consequence of it. Is it going to be very negligible impact, or it could be a reputational impact to your organization, or it could be a financial impact to your organization. Once we ascertain that particular categorization in discussion with the management, we will come to a conclusion that a particular risk, in this case, it could be a high risk, which is a high fraud risk. And then we'll also define what would be the rating. In this example, I've marked the 4th number on the major category, which is higher probability, and the consequences are likely more likely, certainly likely. So these definitions could be agreed with the management. The terminology, what is that high, medium, and low, could be agreed with the management before the start of the fraud risk assessment. And then we identify the inherent risk ratings. Once we've identified the inherent risk ratings, we will consider the controls to mitigate that particular fraud risk. I've taken a simple example in this case where there is a possibility of asset theft in your organization, and then what kind of control you have in place is you might say that okay, we have insurance coverage on any of the assets on our organization, so that is an effective control for us. We don't need to really worry about if there is any instance. So we will consider that particular control, and we will identify whether whatever we marked as higher risk category in our initial risk rating, and then we'll consider that control, and then we will move that from the major to the moderate risk, because there is effective control in place. When we arrive at the residual risk, which is basically the leftover risk in your organization with respect to theft. But as we are identifying these residual risks, as part of the fraud risk assessment, the team would also give you what kind of additional controls you should have in place, like say the enhancement of the security, office security premises, or surveillance. Such kind of additional remedial actions we will consider, along with giving the remedial plan. As once the activities, the risk assessment is complete, you will have a fraud risk register, or which lists down the complete areas that we've discussed as part of the methodology. Like you will have the fraud risk area, the fraud risk category, and then basically the scenarios, what all possible scenarios in that particular event. And then it will also have the risk factor that we discussed a while ago, saying what would be the inherent risk. And then we'll also plot the controls in place to arrive at the residual risk. As part of this, once this has been done, we will give a remedial action plan, which is called fraud response plan or fraud mitigation plan, which I will show you in a minute. Yeah. So once the fraud risk assessment you made a fraud risk register, it should be remediated using the response plan, like what kind of controls you'll be introducing, who will be the person responsible to do it, and what is the timeline you wanted to do it in terms of remedial action, and then what would be the potential risk rating after you implement these additional controls. That will give you a framework how the company wants to remediate this plan. And then if you look at the overall perspective, it will be a complete package of identifying the risks till remediation action. And then once we have completed this fraud risk assessment, we also need to continuously monitor, which would be based on the organizational structure. It could be with the internal audit, or it could be with the legal and compliance, who will be on a periodic basis will be monitoring how the fraud risk response or treatment plan need to be done. This is how usually the life cycle, as I mentioned in my initial slide. This is a complete life cycle. Once you start with the identification of factors, you will complete the risk register and identify the remedial action, and then you will continuously monitor the fraud scenarios. If there is any additional scenarios that you come across after change in the process, that needs to be updated as part of the action plan. And on a usually there is the best practices that says is every 2 years you need to renew or to review your fraud risk registers to make sure that whatever the identified fraud risk scenarios that you identified are actually applicable based on the existing scenarios. So that is how fraud risk assessment will be done. I'm open to take any questions if you have. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks very much, guys. I think by way of introduction, my name is Dean Gilbert. I've been with Deloitte only 3 months, but I'm not a stranger to the region. I've been in the Middle East for the past 4.5 years, with the Big Four consulting, a total of 13 years in my life. The areas that I focus on are digital forensics, cybercrime, data analytics, and anything where technology is being used to investigate fraud and corruption. And just joined the Deloitte guys. I think we've got a team of about 80 with 20 digital forensic specialists across the region. So before I start, I guess, by show of hands, how many of you have used technology to investigate or try to detect fraud or corruption? Okay. How many of you have used artificial intelligence, machine learning, big data, Hadoop type technologies? Okay. Yeah, okay. All right. So I think my conversation or my discussion is around the use of technology, how to detect, prevent fraud. But I'm going to, as learning objectives, trying to get through the differences between structured and unstructured data, how to use sources, how you can use sources of data to detect or investigate fraud or corruption, maybe a glimpse of what the future is looking at in terms of the detection and investigation process. And what I'll be going through there is an example of machine learning, as well as another one for unstructured data, artificial intelligence application that's on the marketplace. In a wrap-up, I'll be going through a case study that was done here in the region. And if there's time permitting, if you're still awake, I'll carry on with the best practices and how the incorrect procedures may interfere or affect the sources of digital evidence in an investigation. So I think the definitions of data I'm pretty confident that majority of you understand the difference between structured and unstructured data. Structured refers to data that's in a fixed field format, maybe within a database, Excel spreadsheet, a comma-separated value file, whereas unstructured data refers to information that may not necessarily be in a row column format. That could be emails, it could be on a file server with shares, Word documents, PowerPoints, where everyone is sharing information. It could be on your iPhone, it could be on your Samsung device, any information that's not necessarily transactional. Examples of structured data and the practical uses of scenarios. I put this up there because of over the past 13 years of experience, these are the types of sources of information that we've used to drive data-driven investigations and or to help solve them. Some very common examples of data coming through from your ERP systems, your operational systems, but even investigations, you can go as far as using event logs or internet history. All your servers within your organizations should have log or audit trails activated, as well as your computer security logs, looking at your security operations center, FIRE, Blue Coat, Web Sense, and then right down to sensor data, for example, the building access tags that one uses to enter an organization in the workplace. Some of the most common investigations where transactional data has been used across the Middle East, procurement and spend analysis and vendor fraud is very prominent. It is a large and growing concern. It's an area of opportunity, especially within the procurement process. Conflicts of interest are often identified during the procurement process where people have not disclosed their financial interests or there's a relationship between employees and or suppliers. Travel and expenses also seems to be very prominent within the region, given that we all travel for our businesses. A number of consulting firms are always traveling between the regions, trying to either improve the region or improve the business. User access reviews are quite important as well. It seems to be mistaken that, and as Rini has mentioned, in a fraud risk assessment, the level of access that a user has to a system, it may not necessarily be a password that has or hasn't been changed, but the circumvention of that password can be investigated by looking at, say, audit trails and what the user has clicked on the screen, whether it's a share trading price, whether it's a loan portfolio that is not authorized to access. Loyalty and beneficiary award systems where schemes and loans are being advanced. We've done a number of investigations. Who's capturing, authorizing, and approving loans? Are the loans being, are the individuals capturing and authorizing, vetting, or correctly performing due diligence on individuals? As well as vehicle fleet management, expenditure, tying your operational data back to your financial data. And then again, touching on a broader perspective, cybersecurity and breach indicator. A number of organizations leave themselves vulnerable to a threat or an attack, where an attacker simply has to send in an email with a link, you click on it and they've got full access to your financial systems and or email systems. And they are there 9 years before you're even aware. From an unstructured perspective, it becomes a little bit more tricky because of the technology that's used to analyze unstructured data. The sources of data for this, for example, would be your server, your archives, your desktops, laptops, mobile phones, shared folders, network drive, a home directory. Even your social media and what is out in the public domain. A number of you may have heard of the OSINT network, or Open Source Intelligence Network, where if you know some information about someone, whether it's an email address or a Facebook account, you can use that to link further to identify who their friends are, colleagues are, what they like, what they don't like. A common practice, if you have a business meeting with somebody and you don't know who they are, you can find out what their hobbies are, if they like fishing or quad biking or camping in the desert. And when you shake hands with them to have a meeting with them, you've got general conversation. It's also used in forms of getting close to a suspected employee. So in a cyber attack, you may have the strongest perimeter devices or security operations center, but the janitor who's cleaning and the floors or cleaning the desks at night, if you give him 20,000 reals to go and plug a USB drive into a computer on the floor, he's not going to say no. And 45,000 machines may be compromised and dropped overnight, as we've heard a number of stories in the region. But there's a lot of examples of the practical use of where unstructured data is requested. More and more we're seeing across the regions for regulatory investigations, whether it's sanctions or look-back reviews, to see whether people are engaging in economic transactions with politically exposed people or sanction restricted entities. Insider trading within organizations, there's your common internal chat, there's WhatsApp messages, there's your Skype for business, there's a number of platforms that we instead of sending an email, we chat. Only until not too long ago was a lot of business within the kingdom done through WhatsApp chat groups, which until recently wasn't encrypted and wasn't secure. With endpoint security or endpoint encryption, it is. But even a Facebook Messenger and a Facebook chat these days, not necessarily encrypted unless you activate it within the settings. But a lot of the unstructured data, as you can see, can be used to do these types of investigations, and the world is moving towards a large volume of data. I think the amount of data that's been generated in the past 2 years is more than the history of mankind, and that will continue to grow. So how do we analyze these sources of data? And obviously we can't do it ourselves. Data is going ahead of the technologies that we have. So touching on the future of analytics, I've got an example of a company that's been using machine learning and artificial intelligence for the past 10 years. Although that machine learning and data science and all the buzzwords around technology are only surfacing last year, maybe the year before, it's been used by a number of technology companies. An example is PayPal. If you look on the left, the statistics of transactions from 2015, 4.9 billion transactions. They've got a global reach across 202 countries. And the nice statistic about PayPal is that they've got 18 investigators that cover the entire globe, and they have a fraud ratio of 0.06%. So engaging with PayPal, you have a 0.06% of that transaction either being fraudulent or not. And how they have implemented their artificial intelligence and machine learning is by using a combination of human story-based intelligence. So how creative can you get? If you were an investigator and you had a machine doing everything for you, how can you come up with a new way of committing fraud? They then use data mining on their big data systems. They're using H2O as a test platform for machine learning. And the example I got here is something that I don't know if many of you, I know I certainly have been subject to, is when I go on a holiday or vacation, I land in another country, I swipe my credit card and it's blocked because I didn't phone the bank and tell them, well, I'm going on a holiday. These days that doesn't happen because the banks are using intelligence to understand your patterns of movements and where you're moving. An example for PayPal was that they had a pilot that was flying home for Christmas and buying presents on, buying presidents sounds like America, buying gifts for his family on the way. And what was happening is he was buying in Hong Kong, he would stop off in Singapore and then went through to Mumbai and then did the round trip flight. But instead of blocking the transactions, what he was looking at is the investigators picked it up. They went onto his Facebook. They were able to analyze they went onto his Facebook. They were able to analyze his movements, where he's been, and they fed that back into the artificial intelligence. And as a result, all his friends who were pilots, the AI could learn that, and no transactions were blocked. PayPal hasn't gotten rid of any of the investigators. All they do is come up with new creative scenarios on how to detect or prevent fraud. From an unstructured perspective, this is quite a graphical representation of a tool that's in the marketplace. The tool that is used here is called BrainSpace, and it's the industry leading for unstructured data. And as you can see, you can take any source of information, feed it in, and be able to categorize data according to the concept. So you don't necessarily have to do a keyword search across your organization to see who's in possession of certain information. Artificial intelligence learns what's within those documents and data and puts it one side. So on the left you've got music and song-related information. On the right-hand side you've got videos. The applicable use of this is contracts. An example of 29,000 capital projects, expenditure, bill of quantities, site reports. This tool is able to ingest it and group documents together. And you're then able to perform keyword searches or do a relationship map to see who's been in possession of documents and who's distributing them across the network. All right. So finally, just a quick case study within a bank that is locally based. We used a number of technologies, and I think in the interest of time, either take a photograph or we can check whether we can distribute the slides afterwards. But our initial mandate was that a client had noticed that there was a number of closing balances being changed within the bank over the period of 6 months, lost hundreds of thousands of Saudi riyals. We were asked to come and assist to identify who had potentially changed the closing balances within the bank. This resulted in us creating forensic copies of cell phones and laptops and servers, including the T24 banking system where we had the assistance of Microsoft. And we had to look at the internal communications to see who's been discussing the financial system and or potentially updating this financial system. We had to do walkthroughs with everybody, understand the systems and the processes, but in the end, we found that the usernames and passwords hadn't been changed, typical control weakness, and that logs and auditing were only enabled for 30 days, and we needed 12 servers to be reconstructed for each month of the year that we were going to investigate. Long and short, the system could be manipulated in 2 ways, either from a database backend or from the application gap between the database. We couldn't find anything. By investigating the laptops and the computers, we couldn't find any communications. So we stepped all the way back to getting other logs from around the building. Absolutely anything on anybody's movement or behavior. So we had the building access logs when they swiped in and swiped out, their CCTV footage, as well as Windows server logs when they logged into the laptop, who they picked up from the landline and made an external call to, as well as corporate issues, cell phone records. As you can see on the right, we only had to sort the data into what we call a super timeline, and we could see the movements of the user entering the building, logging onto his computer, sending an email to somebody else, logs onto the banking system, makes 3 changes, exits the building, makes phone calls to his friends, and then we had the CCTV footage. But the importance here is the sources of data. By just looking at, say, the transaction and order log on a T24 system, because of the username and password being defaults or system, we couldn't pin the user down. But by looking at logs and data across the entire organization, we were able to put 6 people, 2 different syndicates within the bank behind their computers at the time of the changes of the transactions taking place. And that's it.
Thank you. It's time for questions. Anybody who has a question, please mention your name and your company name, and try to make your questions short. Okay. Anybody has a question? أي واحد عنده سؤال باللغة العربية بيسأل حتى باللغة العربية. عندنا الأخ المترجم يطرح السؤال، ممكن تتكلم عن طريق المايك. واضح يعني presentation ما في لحظات مداخلات.
I have one question actually. Okay, so as per the IRA standards, auditors should not look for fraud. So as per you said that internal audit should look for should conduct the fraud risk assessment. We do actually similar like that, but it's a risk assessment, and we're not only focusing on fraud. So what kind of department that you think that should actually focus on these things or conduct such kind of risk assessment?
I can answer this question. Usually it depends on the organizational structure. If you don't have any legal and compliance person, obviously the department which is responsible for monitoring the entire organizational compliance and related activities falls under the gamut of internal audit. When we say it could be combined with the ERM practice, if internal audit is actually doing an enterprise risk assessment. So in some of the clients that we worked with, internal audit takes the responsibility, but the compliance officer would take in charge of monitoring on a periodic basis. So in short, the compliance officer would be the responsible person, but if your company doesn't have any compliance person, then internal audit has to take it up. But internal audit will not be identifying the fraud scenarios, because sometimes they are not equipped with how to identify fraud risk scenario.
But as internal audit, we could look for the red flags. So I think that's a part of like fraud looking. But you mentioned that 50% of the organization are only conducting fraud kind of risk assessment.
Right.
But I don't think it's a kind of mandatory for either financial control or internal audit to do such kind of work.
There is no regulation or kind of standard that says you need to conduct a fraud risk assessment, but only it is more on a proactive basis. The company might go and say, we might want to be the best in the class of the companies in say Riyadh or Saudi. They might proactively take this fraud risk assessment and implement.
But as I said, it's like for auditors, it's against our will. So what kind of department do you think that should have this kind of obligation to do? Or
It's compliance who should take it
compliance,
up.
but as compliance mostly also falling under internal audit. If you're doing compliance and insurance.
Yeah, that's the reason I was saying it depends. We need to see how the organization structure is, and we can suggest if it needs to be done by the internal audit or it should be
How about risk assessment departments?
I haven't seen in this region you have a specific department who as a risk assessment, unless that organization is quite big to highlight a particular department as a risk assessment. Usually in Dubai I've seen it goes under risk internal audit team or risk advisory team. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I did not say my name's Madam Mukbir from King Faisal Specialist Hospital. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm Basim Al-Assam, the Digital Ethics and Compliance Officer. First of all, I would like to thank the Chamber of Commerce for allowing us to attend such a workshop, which I believe is an extension of the efforts that the government of Saudi Arabia is doing to raise the awareness about the ethics and compliance and anti-corruption. The last 2 days I was in the International Nazaha conference, which I believe that in Saudi Arabia we are in a period where we need to grasp this opportunity. The awareness is going up and everyone is becoming fraud smart. Transparency is more than any time before, questioning and also reporting. However, I believe that as someone from Saudi Arabia or from the Middle East, I think the structure of the society is different from the Western world. So if you go, for example, to check the dimensions of Jirt Hospital, you would see that Saudi Arabia is a collective society where the people there are depending with the groups rather than individuals. When you are talking about things like the gifts, conflict of interest, favoritism, it will not be easy, in such societies to disclose your conflict of interest. For example, if you know someone in the government sector, because everyone has a relative somewhere else. Also, it will be sometimes difficult to resist or reject gifts and hospitality, because this could be seen by the group and by the family and the tribes as something offensive. Also for wasta or favoritism. sometimes if you are not helping the others to get their places in where you are working, this could be seen by the group as something that is not appropriate for you. When we are talking about these challenges, how would Deloitte or anyone in the ethics and compliance field customize the ethics and compliance programs to cope with our culture, with our society, and the structure of it? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I touched on it briefly in my talk. I think it's important you take into account, like you said, local customs in conjunction with local laws, and then build your compliance program, build your policy or code of ethics around that. I was also at the Nazar conference yesterday, and I don't know if you sat in on the talk from the gentleman who founded Transparency International. He had quite a good quote. He said, he touched on exactly what you were saying. He said, Saudi Arabia or the Middle East is unique. You don't have to do what the Western world is doing. You do what's best for the Middle East. So you have to build your own compliance program. You have to build your own policies and procedures, taking into account the culture and your own local laws and legislation.
Thank you.
Kamil Khairi, Cystic Trading. I'm the Executive Director. Just a simple question. Is there any type of agreement or any type of understanding between, as he mentioned, Nazaha, which is the National Anti-Corruption Commission, and Deloitte on putting together a specific strategy for Saudi Arabia, relying on the cultural type aspects, etc., and the way the new Vision 2030 as well? Thank you.
It's a good question. Thank you very much. We did meet with the vice. I'm not sure of the gentleman's title. It wasn't the head of Nazar, it was one of his deputies yesterday, just on that point. And the issue we discussed with them is building a toolkit based on the new ISO standard, an anti-bribery toolkit that we could make available in conjunction with Nazar and distribute this to organizations so that they get an understanding of what their requirements are in respect of building anti-bribery compliance programs. So sort of a kickstart, maybe risk assessment, a mini risk assessment that would help organizations understand their risks and how to mitigate those.
More question? Thank you, Mr. Rol. Thank you, Mr. Dean. Thank you, Mr. Hassan. Thank you, Mr. Skinifaz. It was excellent presentations. Thank you for all of you. Any comments, or we can conclude? Okay, that's it. Thank you for coming.
If you allow me, please, I would just like to highlight that أتكلم بالعربي كمان أسأل الجميع. يعني في نظامين صدروا طبعا في المملكة، نظام مكافحة الرشوة ومكافحة غسيل الأموال. وطبعا مكافحة غسيل الأموال تتطلب من المنشآت التجارية والمهنية والمؤسسات المالية طبعا في المقام الأول بتعيين يعني مسؤول عن مكافحة غسيل الأموال، وكيف طريقة إبلاغ الجهات أو المسؤولة أو وحدة التحريات المالية في وزارة التجارة أو في وزارة الداخلية عن أي شبهة في أي معاملة حدثت أو يعني توقع حدوثها. ففقط للتنويه وشكرا جزيلا لكم.